Yeah, I'm going to read it. Yeah,
Right, people in the meeting, so I'm going to start the video.
yeah,
Thank you.
guys. Yeah.
You're here.
All your students and friends.
Last year student. It's just an extension of class.
Right. 1 minute out. Might have to test the sound.
We are walking down. Yeah. Some ladies, I don't think it was there. Yeah.
You have any
Yeah, I'm happy if you're happy.
kind of happy here,
I'll let people in.
learning to use glass in fact.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we do. Please.
Yeah, there'll be noise from the hallway for sure. I think 3 other events going on right now.
Interpretation falling to the ground, his hand going down to the ground to try and support it more.
Yeah, just getting everybody in.
Jimenez will be forward ball towards Luis Suarez, one in the air by
Oh, speaker.
At least they're faithful.
Sounds okay. Yeah, just checking the visual. Yes, very good.
Great. Like the- find a seat. Well, great. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this year's LRG lecture, which will be delivered by Tiffany on the topic of decolonizing landscape. But before you all hear from Tiffany, there's a couple of things I've been asked to say to you all by way of introduction. The first is to acknowledge the financial support we received from Taylor and Francis as part of our publishing agreement, which enables us to host events like these and showcase wonderful work researchers by Tiffany. And the second thing is to connect Tiffany's presentation today with some of the current things we're doing in the journal. So over the past few years, the editorial team at Landscape Research has been implementing what we have called an ethos of care, inspired by the scholarship of Maria Kaewen Dang and her 2012 article, "Nothing Comes Without Its World, Thinking with Care." We've used this ethos to present a vision for careful reviewing, by which we mean asking reviewers to take care of authors by engaging in constructive and intellectually generous forms of exchange. Continuing to think with Kaewen Dang and her assertion that relations of thinking and knowing require care, we have since endeavored to expand that ethos by including expectations about inclusive writing cultures and practices. Informed by a range of scholars working in Indigenous studies, disability studies, and gender studies, we have called on both submitting authors and again our reviewers to ensure that material for publication in the journal is current and inclusive, and adheres to a set of overarching principles that recognize that all individuals have the right to be described in a respectful and thoughtful way, that recognizes the past and continuing evolution of language and its consequences, that prioritizes self-identification, and that reflects the diversity of landscape research scholarship. Many of our efforts in this regard have fairly comfortably aligned with recent calls to decolonize the academy, which in turn obviously aligns with the topic of Tiffany's presentation today. Our efforts have been about confronting what Burgess, Cormack, and Reed describe as the values and organizing principles of universities and associated academic practices, which are built on and are sustained by settler colonial ideas about race and class and gender. Indeed, much of what we've been thinking about and doing at the journal in the last few years echoes what Indigenous and Southern scholars have been arguing for at least 40. That is, that despite holding ourselves up as centers of critical thinking, universities are often complicit in deepening the violent conditions of colonial extraction and alienation. My own work in the field of landscape intersects with the field of heritage studies, which has long been implicated in the colonial project, orchestrating as it does which pasts are to be remembered and which are to be erased. As bedfellow to history, geography, archaeology, and anthropology, heritage studies was and is instrumental to colonialism's execution. This remains the case despite calls to decolonize the field, which have only seen us, to borrow from, I could turn the page, falls down, to borrow from you, to borrow from Tiffany, to mitigate the effects of colonialism rather than strive for the complete abolition of colonial power structures. All of this is to say that much of what Tiffany will speak about today is important to me and important to the work we've been doing at Landscape Research because of what it implies about care and accountability, and what it implies about inspecting closely the histories and narratives we have always used to understand ourselves. It is about acknowledging histories that have been silenced and ignored, and holding ourselves accountable for the pain such ignorance can and will cause. And so it is with great pleasure that I introduce Tiffany to you all today. Tiffany is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge and a seminar instructor, as we now know very well, UCM. She's also a landscape architect and territorial scholar from Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Tiffany has received many awards in her career, one of which was the 2021 Landscape Research Best Paper Prize for an Early Career Researcher for her article, Decolonizing Landscape. This article was also selected as one of our commissioned essays in 2020 and is the most downloaded paper for 2022. Her research lies at the intersections of landscape, settler colonial studies, ecology, history, and geography. And she's interested in using decolonial approaches to subvert dominant power structures and infrastructural networks shaping territory today. Her PhD tackles this via an examination of the history and evolution of the Canadian National Park System as an infrastructure of colonization. Through her research, Tiffany has the ultimate ambition of developing intersectional feminist futurist projections and decolonial strategies for the future of national parks. So welcome, Tiffany, and thank you very much for your time today. We look forward to you.
Thank you. It's a very generous introduction. Thanks to everyone for being here, and thank you especially to Tim and Emma and Emily for inviting me to speak, and not only for inviting me to speak, but also for their sort of role in facilitating the original publication of the paper in 2021, and also support through that process. It's been really nice to be able to share. I'm happy to share with you all here today as well. So the article that I wrote, Decolonizing Landscape, I don't know if anyone read it, but if you notice that I spell decolonizing with a Z instead of an S, and despite this being a journal that follows British English spelling conventions, which would spell decolonize with an S, but I think it was really important to me to make this a really small change because I wanted to use that to call attention to the differences in discourses on colonialism and colonization and decolonization between North America, where I come from and where my work is primarily based, and then also the UK, where I now live and teach and study. And some of the main differences that I've noticed are in the UK, decolonization and colonialism typically refers to reconciling a history of transatlantic slavery, and then also discourse of colonialism tends to lean more towards context in global South. This is different from the North American case, where definitely histories of transatlantic slavery are still very, very present, especially in the US. But this is sort of on top of a secondary consideration, or a second consideration, which is the very present of Indigenous dispossession and reconciliation, which is common to the settler colonial context of North America, and also places like Australia and New Zealand and South America as well. And so this is something that I wanted to call attention to sort of at the beginning of the talk, and also because this is something that grounds my work. So for those who are not familiar, settler colonialism is a distinct form of colonialism. It seeks to eliminate an Indigenous population and replace them with a settler population who claim the land as their own and then come to extract resources. So a place like Canada or the US is an example of this. It is a structure that is continuously being produced and enacted over specific territories and geographies. And there's sort of a widely argued line in settler colonial studies that settler colonial nations are not post-colonial. They are lands that are actively under current colonization currently, essentially. And this is evidenced by an ongoing processes of Indigenous dispossession and a dominant settler colonial body politic, essentially. So in the settler colonial context, and really in all colonial contexts, generally land is really, really central to the decolonization project. And decolonization is land-centered and linked to Indigenous self-determination and territorial autonomy of Indigenous nations. And so I bring the sort of contention. If land is central to the decolonial project and process, then landscape studies as a field which is concerned with the study, design, ordering, etc. of land, then landscape studies has some stake, at least some small stake or large stake in processes of decolonization. And so this is what grounds my thinking in decolonizing landscapes. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the spatialities of settler colonial or of colonial power dynamics. And so you can think about power dynamic of colonialism as a sort of nested scales of superiority and sort of inferiority. I guess. Well, I'll just give you an example. So resources in colonies are extracted by sort of central metropoles, which benefit politically and economically from having extracted resources from colonies elsewhere. And so in the history of the British Empire, you could think of London as a sort of metropole of the larger British Empire, which had a geography spanning almost the entire planet. And so, for example, in my home country of Canada, sort of you can see that the distribution of the major cities are primarily in the south, along the border with the US. And so this is our road network, which kind of gives you a sense of the settlement and distribution of like urbanism. And that is juxtaposed with what I'm calling extraction territories, which here is represented by mineral, oil, gas claims, and leases. And so you can see how there's sort of a spatial divide between where resources are extracted and where primarily people live. And this is somewhat related to sort of neo-Marxian approaches to urban studies and urban theory, but I would argue that colonialism sort of takes it a little bit deeper, so you get a more nuanced and fuller understanding of the sort of spatial difference. Yeah, and then finally, this layer is a layer of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit reserves in Canada, which introduces the idea that settler colonialism is spatial and racial. And so you can see how a lot of these Indigenous territories are sort of scattered in the same sort of hinterland territories of extraction. And I would argue that in recent years, actually, the sort of distance between the extractive nature of the hinterlands has started to enter urban life and urban thinking and the urban realm. And this is sort of really encapsulated well by the 2016 Standing Rock protest, which really took the attention of the entire world. I mean, it made it into the New York Times, which is a pretty big deal, right, for a protest, for an Indigenous driven protest movement. And so in my paper, I talked primarily about the Wet'suwet'en pipeline protest, which was in a remote part of British Columbia, which is Western Canada, sort of nearish to the border of Alaska. And so basically in early 2020, before the pandemic started, so in January and February, land defenders from the Wet'suwet'en Nation were blocking access to a construction site for a natural gas pipeline on their territory. I have a map, yes. So yeah, you can see this is like Alaska here. And this is, so you can imagine like how remote this region is, essentially. So yeah, an injunction was issued and the protesters were being arrested. This region, despite its sort of remoteness, there's not even cell phone reception here where they were defending their territory. Despite this remoteness, it actually made it into mainstream Canadian media, and there was like widespread solidarity protests that broke out throughout the nation. And I argue that this sort of brings remote territorial conflict into urban space. So there were demonstrations outside of government buildings, major transportation corridors were blockaded, a few universities had, student walkouts. Most significantly, the rail connection between Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, which is Canada's sort of most important political and economic corridor, was actually successfully blockaded by protesters in solidarity of what was happening nearly 4,000 kilometers northwest. And they disrupted passenger traffic for nearly a month, and not only stopped because of COVID lockdown, which happened in March, which made everyone go home and stay in their homes and then never come out again. Yeah. So from from the surface, you could easily misconstrue this kind of protest and solidarity movement as an environmental protest, as it was sort of a protest against a pipeline. However, if you look deeper at history, you can really understand more complex colonial antecedents and histories of indigenous dispossession and British imperialism, which underlie the conflict. So basically, this brings us all the way back to 1763 with a document called the Proclamation of 1763, which was issued by King George III of England. The goal of the proclamation was to acquire land for the British Empire. And this proclamation basically prohibited settlers from obtaining land by saying that the land first had to pass through the hands of the British Crown. And so essentially, the British Crown would negotiate with indigenous peoples to have them cede their land, and then the Crown would then distribute the land to the settlers. And so this is a very key proclamation because in 1997, there was a court case in Canada called the Dalgamuku decision, and it used this 1763 proclamation basically to say that Indigenous peoples had inherent rights to their land, because the argument was, in order to be able to cede their land to the British, they first had to have title to that land, essentially. And so this has been a very key precedent-setting decision in Canada that underlies a lot of land claims today that are undergoing in the Canadian court system. And so in the case of Wet'suwet'en, no treaty had actually ever been negotiated between the British Crown and the Wet'suwet'en Nation. And so the argument can be made that the land is unceded, and therefore when the Canadian government and police came in to remove protesters, the Canadian government was enacting Canadian territorial sovereignty and rejecting Wet'suwet'en territorial sovereignty of their nation. And this really sort of just brings to fore, the very present geography of settler colonialism, I think. And I'm going to make a little bit of a jump, but maybe I can help you situate. So if you travel along Montreal, Wet'suwet'en is over here. So if you can imagine that solidarity protests blocked this chunk of railway. It really did make national news, I guess what I'm trying to say. And so it's really significant that it was railway infrastructure that was blockaded in solidarity because of the significance of infrastructure, national infrastructure as part of a colonial project. Infrastructure like railways and roads is what allows sort of settler occupation to happen in a colonial context. And so this point that I want to make with infrastructure is also that infrastructure is built by a very specific labor. And in the context of the Americas, a vast majority of the railway infrastructure in both North and South America were actually built by coolie laborers from Asia after the abolition of slavery in the US. And so this brings a sort of secondary layer of racialization to the story of settler colonialism and the structure of settler colonialism. Did we find out what that was?
No.
Okay.
A bit worried.
All right. So all this to say, landscape. Oh yeah, here's a picture of the coolie laborers who built the Canadian Railroad. All this to say, landscape has a role to play in this history, and one example of that, is in the dramatic transformations to the landscape that were made through things like railroads and ongoing extraction. And so one of the questions I get asked a lot when I sort of talk about these kinds of things in Europe and in the UK is like, we don't live in a settler colonial context, so what does that mean for us, and how do we engage with the discourse? And so I think this quote is quite good because it talks about how, I'll just read it. Even if we are not inhabiting a specific place of contemporary settler colonization, the complex and interdigitated nature of globalization and neoliberalism means that profits and accumulations drawn from settler colonial geographies implicate people and places beyond specific state borders. And I think that this is a really interesting question to ask in the context of landscape studies, and of landscape architecture and of landscape practice and landscape research. You know, there's in the 80s and 90s, there's this sort of neo-Marxian version of landscape scholarship that emerged, you know, people like Stephen Daniels and Dennis Cosgrove and W.J.T. Mitchell, who really advocate that landscape is a political tool. Landscape is a key to ideology, and it not only reflects social political relations, it's not only symbolic, but it also is an instrument and agent of power in and of itself. Landscape has the capacity not only to influence cultural perceptions of space, but it can actually transform space materially, especially in landscape architecture. All of my students can tell you. Yeah, and so I want to take this a little bit further, and I borrow from the art historian Charmaine Nelson, who has this wonderful piece where she posits landscape representation is actually a form of discipline, and she sort of plays on the word discipline, landscape as a way of disciplining land, as a landscape can control land, and I think that's quite a powerful imagery, you know, in the context of discussing landscape and colonization. And so technologies of landscape, including cartography, have for centuries sort of been part of the colonial process and project. So for example, this is the 15th century map of the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was a treaty that was signed between Spain and Portugal. They basically drew this line, and they said, okay, everything east of here is Portugal, and then everything west of here is Spain. And then, you know, that's a very clear, you know, demarcation of you know, using mapping to exert sort of colonial power over a space. Yeah. Painting can also be seen as a form of colonial violence in the way that landscape painting sort of chooses to highlight and erase certain parts of the landscape. And so an example that I show here is a group of landscape painters from Canada who were working in the 1920s called the Group of Seven. So in the 1920s in Canada, there was sort of a movement in the post-World War I period to sort of create a more Canadian identity that was separate from the British identity. And so one of those things was a lot of art movements sort of emerged in this time. And the Group of Seven developed this style of landscape painting that essentially erased people from the landscape, and sort of, you know, things like trees and rocks sort of became prominent central figures in all of their paintings. And this really is a form of, it can be read as a form of territorial violence, as it sort of erases, you know, centuries and centuries and centuries of indigenous societies who resided on this land. Architecture and landscape architecture can also be tools of colonization. An example that I have that I wrote about in the paper, I'm borrowing this from Rod Barnett, who is a Maori landscape architect, actually. But he writes about the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial in St. Louis in the US.
Sorry, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, and so in the memorial marks the starting point of the Lewis and Clark expedition across the American West. And in the 1960s, there was a landscape designed by a famous American landscape architect called Dan Kiley. He was a very famous American landscape architect. For those who are landscape architects, you will know him. But anyway, he's designed this sort of famous memorial, and then in 2016, MBVA, which is a New York-based landscape architecture firm, was tasked with sort of renewing the design of the park, which commemorates American expansion to the West. And so this landscape design, Rod Barnett argues, contributes to continued indigenous erasure and the naturalization of settler versions of colonial history. So I'm going to quote from him. Using a landscape language of wilderness, allée, and grove, partially inherited from the modernist Kiley, MVVA proposes a public-friendly landscape memorial nicely complicit with a narrative of westward expansion that excludes the Native American experience, contributing to the view that it's over. Let's be clear about this. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 that gave President Andrew Jackson authority to negotiate the resettlement of Southern tribes the Missourian Indians signed a treaty stating that the lands in question can never be made available for Indian purposes, and therefore they were seen to have been given a consent to the government for extinguishing their rights to their land. And so like this treaty, Barnett says, the memorial effectively removes Indians from public space and relocates them into another geography, this time underground in the museum as cultural objects on display. And so actually the museum for the memorial is underground here below the arch. And so it's literally like burying the history that like no one wants to admit to. And so it's quite a sort of evocative and powerful symbol of that. And it's kind of striking that MBBA was, you know, like that was what they're proposed to design, you know? It's quite crazy. And so Barnett has this wonderful quote in that paper. He says, landscape architects are in everything they do, contributing to the political landscapes that all things dwell within. And I think that this is something that should be taken on by every landscape architect and every landscape architecture student as a sort of reminder that the choices we make in the studio have real impact in the real world. That's quite powerful. I don't remember what the next slide is. Oh yeah, okay. So it's widely acknowledged by scholars of Native studies and activists across the globe that the primary political agenda of decolonization is the return of colonized lands to Indigenous sovereignty. And this is coupled simultaneously with a sort of radically transformed appreciation of non-colonial ways of relating to land. Other ways that you can say this are like adopting non-Western ontologies. So the discipline of landscape has played a significant role, as you know, I've just talked about, a significant role in inscribing colonial value systems onto colonized lands, and decolonizing landscaping require uninscribing these lands with uninscribing the colonial value from these lands, and recovering landscapes that have been sort of plundered by colonial extractivism, and regrowing and repairing landscapes into sort of more healthy and thriving ecologies. And so this is a painting by a Canadian Cree landscape painter called Kent Monkman. And his paintings are very interesting because he basically subverts the sort of traditional landscape painting, which has raised Indigenous bodies from the landscape, and he sort of queers and indigenizes the genre of landscape painting. So you can see in this picture, there is you know, some drag Indigenous people here, and then there's a presumably white European painter here, and he's painting the landscape, except despite the sort of three men in drag right in front of him, his painting is just of the landscape behind it. You know, it's a very visual erasure, version of erasure, and sort of a satire that really calls attention to that.
You're okay, half past.
Yeah, and so I guess one of the things that I talked about in my paper is the sort of moments of fissure in the sort of colonial fabric, especially in urban colonial fabric, which is sort of where settler political and economic power is centered. So there's this development that's just started construction, I think earlier this year in Vancouver, called SNOC. And SNOC is really interesting because it sits at the sort of intersection of the sort of ruptures to the colonial fabric. And it's this very dense, very tall, I think one of the tallest buildings in Vancouver will be part of this development when it's finished. But it's a unique development because it's being developed by the Squamish Nation. And so in the 19th century, there was a Squamish village and reserve that existed on this land, which was annexed by the city of Vancouver in 1913. And after decades in the courts, a small portion of that land was returned to the Squamish Nation. And so the Squamish Nation has chosen to develop this land into a residential development. And this is unique because of the regulations governing Indigenous land in Canada, basically. So this dates back to the Indian Act of 1876, which is the act that sort of delineated Indigenous reserves for Indigenous peoples to live on. And this act means that the municipal building regulations and urban planning regulations of Vancouver do not apply to this piece of Squamish Reserve land. And so they are able to build the tallest tower in Vancouver and the densest development in Vancouver, and they don't need to account for every apartment unit to have a car parking space and things like this. And so it is a really unique development in this sense. And I see this as a sort of disruption to settler dominated development in cities, essentially. Despite this, there are still some issues with the development. So sections 18 and 20 of this Indian Act basically said that Indigenous nations don't own their reserve lands, and the land is sort of saved for their use by the government, which means that the land cannot be mortgaged or seized, which really puts a limit on the kinds of activities that and has led to sort of centuries of financial oppression, essentially. Also, despite being Indigenous-led, SNOC is very much a capitalist development, and of course, capitalist development is very, very much tied to sort of colonial ways of relating to land. However, I argue that given centuries of systemic dispossession and oppression, SNOC nevertheless presents a sort of opportunity for the Squamish Nation to exercise autonomy on their territory, which is quite unique. So finally, I want to wrap up by talking about decolonial landscape pedagogy, which is something that we all, I assume you came here because you wanted to talk about it. So I think, as I've talked about, current approaches to the built environment very much maintain sort of problematic colonizing logics. This spans everything from development, conservation, management, even reclamation. There's this sort of persistent dichotomy between places that need or are not yet developed and places that are going to be developed. And this is very much comes from the sort of extractive model, extractive ideology of colonialism. And so my challenge to the future of critical landscape studies is really, what does it mean for landscape studies and landscape practice to reject capitalism, reject capitalist development as a driver for designing our built environments? What does it mean to embrace justice-based practices, especially environmentally just practices? What does it mean to dialogue in a reciprocal way, in an interspecies way, in a respectful way? What does that look like? Discursively, I would like to see more intersectional, more diverse engagement with scholarship from Indigenous studies, Black studies, migration studies, decolonial theory. I think all of these things can help feed into the field of landscape studies to help us sort of diversify what we consider to be appropriate, scope of landscape studies, if that makes sense. So I want to finish by showing this picture, which I think is it's a little bit satirical, a little bit tongue-in-cheek example of interspecies thinking and harnessing this, what I'm calling the powerful anti-colonial forces of nature. So this is the Frank Lloyd Wright Pavilion in Banff, Canada, in the Rocky Mountains. I don't know if Frank Lloyd Wright, very famous American architect, practicing he developed this famous building style called the prairie style. I don't know why someone decided there needed to be a prairie style building in the Canadian Rocky Mountains, but so we have it. He built one. It was built in a floodplain in 1913. Because it was in the floodplain, it flooded like constantly. And so this is a picture of it flooded. It was demolished in 1930, so it lasted not even 2 decades. And then I found in the archive this wonderful article in the local newspaper of Banff, which said, "Swamp swallows Banff Memorial to Frank Lloyd Wright." And the first line is, "The inscrutable mire of the Bow River has consumed the remaining traces of what was once a magnificent monument to the genius of one of the world's great architects." And I just love that. It's like, yeah, the river consumed this sort of work of capitalist colonial architecture, and I feel inspired by this river. And so I hope that this kind of can inspire an alternative way of thinking about power and landscape, and nature and building. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiffany. So my job now is just really to give you in some sort of form when you ask me a question, because I'm sure you've got lots of, we've got, what, 30 odd people on Zoom?
40.
40 odd people on Zoom, so I'll be doing my best to, coordinate with Emily the questions that may be coming from there. But please let me open the floor to you all here. If anyone has a question, put your hands up and we'll take it from there. It's okay, I have questions.
You can also stand in silence for 30 minutes. Yes, Helen.
Thank you. That was really inspiring, and I love the finish. It's brilliant. I've done a lot of walking on the Thames with a couple of friends, and one of them works for the Environment Agency, and she's constantly angered by people building on floodplains, and that. And I think it's kind of an irony. You're so greedy, and you want to live next to this water, and it's so beautiful, and then your house gets swallowed up. But how do we operate? And if we're ethical, if we are aspirational in terms of delivering justice and doing things the right way, how can we operate within a kind of a context of capitalism, and where those values develop as land values in cities? We want a quality green space in an area, but it's going to be developed. How can we go forward to make a difference as ethical landscape architects in that context?
I mean, I have an answer for this question, but it's easy for me to say it because I'm an academic and not a practitioner. But I think choosing the right clients that you want to work with, I think is very, very important. And this is one of the things that I tell frequently to students who are looking into going to practice. And when they go to choose practices that they want to apply for jobs, that I usually tell them, like, try to choose practices that are doing at least a good balance of public and private work. And so that even if you do end up having to work on these sort of massive capitalist developments that sort of demoralize your sort of ethics, at least you can still work on these valuable public projects. That's not a very, it's not a very full answer, but that's sort of my answer for it. And then also I would say teaching the young generation, the current generation that are students, and all of my students right here, the current generation of students to care about these things. And if we sort of reach a point, I would love if we reached a point where critical mass of landscape architects had the sort of ethics, that we're talking about, and just flat out refused to do projects with developers who wanted to build in such a way, that would be amazing.
Karen,
I
love that papers.
Thanks.
In your research, have you I love the examples you gave how art has colonialized the landscape and the architecture and stuff. On the reverse, I'm thinking as an Irish person, after independence and the establishment of the Free State of Ireland, there was a decolonializing effort to renaming places, because when the British came in and colonized the country in whatever it was hundreds of years ago, one of the things they did was change the names, and their surveyors came in and they put those lines down in the most ridiculous places, so places that you might know now as Dunleary, south of Dublin, then called Kingstown, but it was reverted to Dunleary. And there's a fantastic play by Northern Irish playwright called Brian Friel called Translations. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's a wonderful live in the theatre, and it's very, very funny, and it's all about this renaming. So I'm wondering, did you explore that in your work? And I also am thinking that in our work as landscape architects, for those of us who are in practice, if we could be mindful to the naming of places. And I've seen, particularly in Ireland, I've seen British developers come in and give them those ridiculous Kentish names to a place like maybe in the west of Ireland or something like that. And do you think it's an important aspect of our work?
Yeah, I think it's certainly an important aspect, and I don't talk about it enough in my work, but I think especially in like from the Canadian context, if a new subdevelopment gets developed, all the roads are like, Green Forest Road and like Lakeway, and like, they're all these sort of naturalistic nature words, and it really sort of goes to the same point with the paintings. They're just erasing what was there before, and they're sort of blanketing it over. And I think certainly as landscape architects, that is within, I would say, our realm of agency, to be more nuanced and careful in our naming. Yeah. Certainly.
It's a related question on online. Which one of those? Okay. Thank you. Are you engaging with the landscape scholarship that links landscape not to aesthetics or colonial ideas of space, but to its origins in social justice and sustainable people-place relations? They're thinking of Ken Olwig's work there. You can probably read it as well. I would digest it better reading it too. So.
Yeah, I would say certainly, I would say certainly social justice and sort of sustainable relations is definitely a part of, I would say, the decolonizing project of landscape, especially in the context of environmental justice in combination with social justice, right? The sort of need for justice comes out of the inequalities of colonial capitalism, and so I definitely see these projects sort of hand in hand. Yeah.
I know you have your hand up. I've got a couple here if you don't mind.
No, that's great.
So Ryan is agreeing with the need to decolonize our approach to landscape studies, and is asking about the United Kingdom, and asks, what modifications could you propose for a decolonization of the ex-empire's domestic landscapes as compared to the decolonization in former colonies across the Atlantic and elsewhere? So here, what modifications would you, I guess he's asking what needs to happen here.
Oh, I see. As opposed to what's happening over there. I mean, I think this is a tricky question, I think, because the UK is very much still an empire in that the UK encompasses Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England. And I think thinking of it domestically in the UK, if that's sort of the context we're working in, navigating that sort of internal imperialism of the United Kingdom is an important project, and I think is something that is not explored enough in landscape studies, and I think is something that could be explored more. And I personally, I don't have enough familiarity with the topic to sort of speak with any authority on it, but I would certainly say that those sort of internal politics of the UK are certainly, significant.
Maybe my question actually follows on from that quite well. I mean, but first of all, thank you for the inscrutable mire.
It's great, right?
It's great. I'm like, more power to the inscrutable mire. I'm going to join. But I'm thinking in terms of ownership, and maybe this is where one of the questions of colonialism in the metropole can really be addressed, is how we deal with ownership of land and rights to land. But my question is kind of a specific one about SNOC development in Vancouver. And while it's clear that there are capitalistic impulses there and that there's some leveling of the playing field, like we're going to have a piece of this kind of thing, I'm wondering about the ownership there. Is the development held in common? And I think then the question of the commons as a historic and pre-imperial expression of landscape in the North Atlantic archipelago where we live. Maybe to answer just that question about Vancouver.
Yeah, I actually don't know very much the details of the project, but I do know that the development is being undertaken by, or in joint partnership with the Squamish Nation and a developer who is like a capitalist developer in Vancouver. But the Squamish Nation were careful to negotiate that they had 51% and that the developer had 49%, so that they could have the final say in all decisions. And so there is something in there, I think, that is interesting. Yeah.
There's a question here from Catherine, who notes that you referenced Daniels, Cosgrave and Mitchell, but they are interested in how you respond to more recent work on non-representational effective approaches to landscape, as well as existing approaches to nature culture entanglements. So she's thinking of Haraway, Anatsoon, and those that seek to incorporate Indigenous knowledge and the lived experiences of landscape into their theorizing.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly say, I mean, you know, in the, you know, in the final slides when I talked about my challenge to landscape as is incorporating sort of Indigenous ontologies as part of that project. I think I have been trying to be very careful in my work over the last few years not to sort of overly rely on this thing called Indigenous ontology to decolonize, because I'm very much of the mindset that colonization is a problem of colonizers, and colonizers should figure out how to get out of it. And yeah, and so I personally, I'm navigating some tricky politics there, but I certainly find a lot of value in the work of people like Anna Singh and Haraway as well.
Yeah.
In decolonizing the landscape, how do you go about raising comments like for the Squamish Nation or the pipeline in the actual colonial sort of structures that are set up in those Indigenous groups, and sort of how those might, like, because all those groups are set up in sort of a colonial nature, the leaders type of thing, and decolonizing them, how did you talk about that at all?
And so the interesting thing about the Wet'suwet'en pipeline protest is that Coastal GasLink, which is the company that is building the pipeline, they maintain that they had negotiated with the Wet'suwet'en because they had negotiated with the elected chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en Nation, but the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en Nation were never consulted, and they are the ones who are issuing the sort of notice to Coastal GasLink to leave, essentially. And so there is a sort of tension there that is worth looking into.
Any further questions we've got? I think Andy's question here is quite similar to what Karen asked, but Catherine has a second question, which is to ask about, you said the goal is to return the landscape, and she's asking, does that mean to traditional use or returning agency to how the landscape can and should be transformed? A question.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I mean, I remember using the word return, but I think return. I think I get it. I think decolonization, one of the sort of main lines of thought is that decolonization ends when the land is not colonized anymore, and the sort of sovereignty is returned to the sort of Indigenous nations that or Indigenous peoples that traditionally, were there. And I think it's more of a question about returning the power relations behind the land to sort of pre-colonial, non-colonial relations, rather than necessarily rewilding or renaturalizing landscape, if that makes sense. And that's why I use the example of Snock in Vancouver, because it's an urban development that sort of sits at the intersection of some of these issues.
Great, yeah, up the back.
I was wondering, like, you talked about the landscapes in that have been used by colonialists to like extract material, and obviously like these landscapes are ruined, or they are like not usable, or they have to have like a very large period of not renaturalization, but remediation somehow.
Yeah.
And how, like, obviously if you give the power back to the Indigenous people of the land, like, do you think that the colonizers have a responsibility of remediating, or how does that dynamic work, because obviously you can give it back, but it's ruined and they can't do anything with it. Or like they can't.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting conception, and I think there's a saying. I think it's I apologize. I think it's Haudenosaunee, which is that they signed. There's a one of the treaties that was signed between the Haudenosaunee Nation and the Canadian or British, whatever, way back was the line was this treaty basically lasts until the rivers no longer run and the grass is no longer growing. And one of the things that's brought up in discussions of this treaty is, well, you know, the river doesn't run, it's been dammed. You know, if the grass isn't growing, we've extracted stuff from it. And so it is an interesting question, and it is something that is I think very present to ask and very important, especially you know, within landscape studies to negotiate and to think about. Yeah.
But someone, I'm not sure if they're asking to be unmuted. Does that mean they have a question, or is that just?
I've asked them to the chat.
Well, any other questions while we wait to see if that one is forthcoming? No? Not from the room. I have a few. They're not they're more about well, one of my questions is, what were you expecting us to ask today that you haven't? I have something wonderful prepared in response that you could share with us. I'm thinking at all.
Putting me on the spot here. I don't know. I don't have anything to. I didn't prepare anything.
None of the usual questions that you're like, oh, I wanted to ask that. I see you intervened to help.
Yeah, well, I'm wondering, because you spoke so much about representation at the beginning, and then you started to talk about landscape architecture, which is very much a practice of representation and prefiguring possible futures. Do you have any ideas about how to draw or change the way in which we represent, either cartographically or through perspective renderings?
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's some clues in Kent Monkman.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very much of the sort of mindset that if representation can colonize, representation can also decolonize. And I think that is an exercise in choosing what to represent and choosing what not to represent and choosing what to bring forward and what to pull back. And yeah, the Monkman is an extremely good example of a form of representation that subverts traditional forms. And I think, speaking specifically to landscape architects, people, or I guess people who draw landscape, which primarily landscape architects and landscape painters, there's something about the language of landscape representation that needs to be subverted. But because landscape representation has a language of its own, only once you speak that language can you know how to subvert it. And so I think it's really an exercise, especially for students in studio, it's really an exercise in drawing and then redrawing and then erasing and then drawing again. Yeah.
We've got more questions now.
Yes, please go ahead. I was thinking about, you mentioned this part of history and you know, the role of coolie workers in the construction of a railway. And it made me think about how, whether you have any ideas of what would decolonizing the landscape would mean in terms of the imperial and the colonizing aspects of, you know, like well, subaltern subjects and non-indigenous subaltern subjects also involved in this project. Like, how would that look like if we take into account, you know, these populations?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And this is something that I only recently started to think about because I realized that it was sort of a gap in the literature of settler colonialism, which primarily the literature these days is sort of dichotomous, and it's all about, you know, one side indigenous ontologies and then on the other side settler. And there's sort of this third space that's missing, which is sort of labor and migration of non-white people of color, in which the coolie laborers are part of. And I don't really have an answer other than to say the Canadian government actually tried to pay reparations to descendants, or not descendants, but like to the laborers who built the railway, I believe in the early 2000s. However, because it was a conservative government at the time, they only paid payments to people who built the railroad and then people who were married to those people. So none of the descendants, none of the ancestors got anything. And then at that point, because it was like 2005, there was only like 6 people left who were still alive. And so, you know, and so it was a moment of history that was kind of a lost chance, I think, a lost opportunity for wider discussion and wider, reparation.
Question, right?
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit like to the house questions about like the representation and the landscape. Because like I did my bachelor in Australia, which is like the a land has been colonized by the British. So I was listening to the State Library for the station for the Aboriginal painting and the painting after the colonization. So you can see what is like very important. You can see like through the colonization and the civilization, the people's reception or perception to the line, like to the perspective has changed, because like the Western idea for picturized is always like multi-layered, but original, the Aboriginal indigenous people are viewed from their eyesight is very plain. So I think that is kind of ideas through the representation to reproduce or manipulate the line. So I think the connection of gather the influence and the respect to the practical world is very interesting.
Thank you for your comment, I guess. Yeah, I'm not very familiar with the Australian context, but certainly there are a lot of intersecting sort of histories.
I think Helen's going.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on a very good question earlier about settlers having damaged or modified, changed the actual landscape. And if we talk about decolonizing it, is it a presumption that like the indigenous people actually want that back, want that landscape, because that is not the landscape that was colonized? So maybe we should be doing like a biodiversity net gain. We should be offering them a different landscape, which is not damaged. I'm just saying, it just seems like a presumption that you would want that land after it has been so modified beyond what you might value. So the values of the indigenous group might preclude it being still valuable. You know, they might, what they value might not be there anymore because it's transformed beyond.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting sort of provocation, an interesting thought. And I think for me as a sort of non-Indigenous person, I can't answer that question, but you know, what I can say is suddenly lost my train of thought. Hold on, I'm gonna get it back. Getting the line back, should we give it back? Oh yeah, I think fundamentally, I think it's all about, or not all about, but it's about sort of territorial sovereignty and sort of agency over territory. And I think there is a negotiation to be had, and that Indigenous nations need to be involved in that negotiation, and it is not a one-sided conversation.
We have time for the last question here, which Tina asks, can you speak a little about successful cross-disciplinary studies or co-studies between those in practice and those in academia?
Ooh, this is a hard question. I mean, I would say landscape studies is a very cross-disciplinary field of study. I mean, all of us here are sort of from different fields, right? And we study landscape from our own perspectives, from our own fields. And you know, landscape research group is a very good example of cross-disciplinary work in landscape studies. And then in terms of like the connections between practice and academia, I think at the moment there is a bit of a gulf, and I have a deep internal fear that it's getting bigger. And it worries me. It really worries me. And I think one of the reasons why I chose to be in academia and chose to teach landscape architecture is because I felt like I could make more difference, influencing the sort of next generation of practitioners than by going out, being the lone thinker of decolonial landscape at, giant landscape architecture office. And yeah, that's my sort of not very satisfying answer for that question. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So, well, I've got to stop the talk. I think we could go on and on, to be honest. Certainly, I've got more questions, just like that one I tried to ask you before. Thanks so much for your time again. Thank you for your wonderful paper today, but also for your contribution to the journal. It's been a really great contribution to the journal. I do want to just finish just with a quick couple of plugs for the journal, which is to let you all know that there are two specials about to either go live or about to go live that may be of interest to people in the room and people on Zoom. The first of those is a special issue gets edited by 3 members of the editorial team that will be an attempt to showcase emerging voices. So an issue that is targeting only PhD students and ECRs, which is using the UKRI definition, so 8 years. But obviously there's some maneuverability there, because we know that's not a particularly useful set of criteria, but it's the best we can come up with. But to support that particular special issue, the LRG has given us a small amount of money, so all contributing authors will get a small honorarium of £200 to help PhD students and ECRs in those times when finances can be tight. The second special issue is actually, so Tiffany, as I mentioned, was one of the recipients of our commissioned essay when we were calling for essays on decolonization. Actually, no, it was landscapes and the future. Yeah, our current call was landscape and care, landscape of care, and we had a lot of terrific people sending submissions. And so we're putting together a special issue, essentially, and a call for expressions of interest to contribute to that special issue on landscapes of care will be on our Twitter and social media pages very, very soon. So do keep your eye on both of those calls for papers. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. Thank you, everybody who joined us on Zoom. It's been really terrific to have so many people here. Thank you for all your questions and triggering that great conversation. And thank you once again, Tiffany, for your time and contributions.
Thank you.